Hello, everybody. But as people join, hopefully we won't have any problems with people joining. We tweaked some last week. I think there were a few people that had trouble getting in, but I think today is working much better. All right. Anyway, this week's Torah portion is Tazria-Mezora. It's actually a double portion. We are right in the middle of Leviticus, and when we started Leviticus, we said there's a lot of things here about sacrifices and a lot of things here about purity. Well, this is a big purity Torah portion. It begins with, it talks about the laws governing when a woman gives birth. It actually mentions the commandment to have a circumcision ceremony. Now, we know that God had already had this covenant with Abraham, but this is the point at which, in this Torah portion, that there's actually a commandment to the nation of Israel, not just carrying along the family tradition to have circumcision, but here it is mandated. There's something very interesting I just want to point out here about this whole giving birth, but it's typical. We have a situation where a natural kind of situation produces a state of impurity. A woman gives birth. There could be nothing nicer or more exciting of a woman giving birth, and yet she is considered to be impure. And not only is she considered to be impure, but she has to go through a process to purify herself, which includes, and we're here at the very beginning, this is Leviticus 12, we're at the very beginning of the chapter. She has to wait, she has to purify herself, and she has to bring an offering. Now, this offering, the word in Hebrew for this type of offering is called a chatat, and that is usually considered to be from the root chet. Chet means sin, and I think you will find in most Bibles that this particular kind of sacrifice is translated as a sin offering. So many people ask the question, why would a woman giving birth need to bring a sin offering? So I heard an explanation once that I thought was very, very good. It said that the translation of the word chatat, is not from the word chet, it's not from the word sin, but it's from the word chitui, which means purification. It means in modern Hebrew, it means disinfectant, but it's like a cleansing, purification type of situation. And so basically then, if we follow that understanding, what the woman is doing is actually going through a purification ceremony. Now, so then, of course, that begs the question, what about giving birth makes her impure? It had a profound effect on me. The most serious level of impurity, and we see this as we're not going through all the verses in Leviticus, but trust me when I say that the most severe level of impurity is contact with death in some way. And we'll see that also later on in Numbers, where we have the way of purification after being in contact with a dead body is through the ashes of the red heifer, which is a far more involved purification ceremony that is needed for any of these other states of impurity. And in Jewish tradition, that is how it's seen, that if you have a scale of impurity from the purest to the most impure, death is the most impure. Now, that doesn't mean there's something wrong with it. It just puts you in a state of impurity. So what does that have to do with birth? And I thought this was a very interesting perspective. When a woman gives birth, there's a living creature that has been growing inside her body for 9 months. And the birth, on the one hand, is a time of life, but it's also a time of death in a sense, because the living person or creature, whatever, that was in her body separates from her body and is no longer part of her body. And so even though it's not death in a classic sense, if death is a separation, then this too is a separation. The woman is separating the baby that had been part of her body, in her body, and is separating from that. So while the baby itself, from the baby's perspective, is now alive in a whole wonderful, wonderful way, from the woman's perspective, she has separated, she has parted from something. And you know, I just think that's really a beautiful idea that helps us remember. And we all know that women who have babies, people talk about postpartum depression or postpartum effects, and there is something that a woman goes through as she parts from this baby that was part of her, even as she rejoices in the baby. And so perhaps this is a sort of parting ceremony, if you will, that a woman does in order to bring herself back. She's for weeks, she is in this never land of impurity, and she comes back. By coming back to the temple, she's rejoining. It's given her that opportunity to adjust, to go through, and then she brings this cleansing sort of sacrifice. So that's just a few words on the beginning of the Torah portion. But the bulk of what I want to talk about today is really what makes up the bulk of both of these Torah portions, and that is the issue of Zoraat. Zoraat is often translated as leprosy. However, leprosy, as we know it in the modern medical sense, really has very little, if anything, to do with the illness or whatever it is that is described here. Leprosy, let's say going back to ancient times, leprosy was seen as a disease. First of all, not just a skin disease, but very often it's a disease where limbs died and people lost fingers and more and whatever. And there's absolutely no mention whatsoever here of that sort of thing. This is more some kind of a scaliness or some kind of a something that, in different patches, whatever, it's different. It's pretty gross, actually, but it's descriptions of different skin afflictions that come in under this category of Zoraat, which, as I said, has been mistranslated to leprosy because leprosy actually got a scientific name, Hansen's disease. It is curable by antibiotics. And if you read this whole description, there's nothing here about illness and there's nothing here about medicine. And who is the one that is involved in leprosy here? Or I should not use the word leprosy. Let me go back to the original Hebrew, Zoraat. Who is involved? It is the priest. So it's kind of hard to see this as an illness in the typical way. And I will go even further. There is a word for illness, Exodus 15. Exodus 15, one of the things that God promises after they leave Egypt, Exodus 15, verse 26, God said, if you will heed the Lord your God diligently, doing what is upright in his sight, giving ear to his commandments and keeping all his laws, then I will not bring upon you any of the diseases that I brought upon the Egyptians, for I, the Lord, am your healer. And here the word for disease is machala. Machala, which, by the way, is also in modern Hebrew, the word for disease or for illness. Okay, so that word for disease or illness does not appear here in this whole this whole bunch of not only Zoraat, but all the other various afflictions that are described here. So therefore, if I put those two things together, first of all, the fact that it is the priest that diagnoses this. Now, keep in mind, unlike the pagan world that believed in magic, that believed in all kinds of, hocus pocus type stuff, when we go to the priest to be cured, we don't believe that the priest has some kind of magic wand. Okay, the priest is acting as a servant or as a messenger of God, and he is instructing them how to do certain things. But there's no concept that the priest is doing something, abracadabra type and suddenly curing somebody. Okay. Also, if you'll notice, the cure is a purification ceremony, similar to what we just talked about after giving birth and all these other purification ceremonies. It's going to the mikvah, for example. If you look at, we're back in Leviticus now, but if you look at chapter 14, verse 9, and this, by the way, is important to understand what this word means. When it's talking about how do you purify yourself from this, from the Zoraat, on the seventh day, He shall shave all of his hair, head, beard, eyebrows. When he has shaved off all his hair, he shall wash his clothes and bathe his body in water. Then he shall be clean. Now, those words, bathe his body in water, has been interpreted throughout the ages as meaning to go into a ritual bath. You don't take a shower. You don't just go swim in the lake. Okay, you're going into a ritual bath. It's a ritual kind of cleansing, and it has a very specific meaning. So this is not, take a medicinal bath. This is a spiritual kind of cleansing ceremony. Also, there's another thing that's very interesting. If you look at chapter 13, verse 13, let me just find it. Chapter 13, verse 13, it talks about the different ways that the priest decides if indeed this is Zoraat, if this person is pure, or if he is in a state of impurity. And one of the things it says is that if the entire body is covered with this skin affliction, then he's considered pure. Okay, now, if you have the chickenpox, okay, whether you have one chickenpox on your cheek or you are covered in chickenpox, it's the same chickenpox. How much chickenpox you have is not going to determine whether you're sick or not. Okay, so this idea of having your whole body covered or just a part of your body, having that be a distinguishing factor, again, is something that doesn't make sense if we're talking about an infection or a disease as we understand it in modern medicine. Two more things that I think are very relevant in understanding this. One is if you look in chapter 13, verse 47, you will see that clothes can have Zoraat. And in chapter 14, verse 34, you will see that a house can have Zoraat. Now, clearly, anything that is an infectious disease does not afflict your clothes and it doesn't afflict your house. Okay, so I think if we looked at all of these facts that we can gather about the Zoraat, I think it's clear that this is not an ordinary medical disease. What it probably is a spiritual disease with physical manifestations. In other words, and we see this in one of the examples that I'm going to show you, it is very often seen as a punishment for something or whatever. In other words, God is giving you this problem for a reason. Okay, you didn't catch it from your neighbor. It's a specific problem meant to teach you a lesson or to punish you in some way. And there are a number of examples of this, but the most classic example, in fact, commentaries, Jewish commentaries, discuss what are the various sins that would have produced this punishment of Zoraat. And in most cases, they're taking it from various examples. The classic example that is used is that it was a punishment for gossip, slander, talking about people in a not nice way. And of course, the classic example of that is in Numbers 12, where we have the story of Miriam. Okay, Numbers chapter 12 begins. Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman he had married. He had married a Cushite woman. Now, it is Miriam who's mentioned first. Miriam and Aaron spoke, and it is interpreted that it is Miriam who actually initiated this. Her name is mentioned first, and she is punished. Aaron is not. So that's the idea. She starts the whole thing. She is basically gossiping to Aaron about Moses. It's not very nice, and God gets very angry at her. And what does he do? He strikes her with leprosy. And we see also that there's an element of shame that is involved with this. In verse 14, this is God is saying this about this whole situation. And he says, if her father spat in her face, would she not bear her shame for 7 days? And he's basically saying she has been given Zoraat because she needs to be in a state of shame. And she's going to be exiled out of the camp for this week. And it's a badge of shame, essentially, to teach her a lesson of not to gossip about her brother or not to even, I mean, she says things that are really not nice, and she's kind of jealous, and we are also priests, and we're also prophets, and why is Moses so special, and that kind of thing. So this is very clearly a message for God, and so our sages take that as an example of that Zoraat would have been a punishment for all kinds of gossip and slander, and that could be seen as a reason why somebody would get Zoraat. Now, when we read a Torah portion in the synagogue, we read we take the Torah portions, we go in order from Genesis to the end of Deuteronomy. Every week we do a certain number of chapters. Every single Torah portion, though, is connected to a particular chapter from the prophets. It's a set chapter or set part of a chapter, whatever. Each Torah portion has its chapter in the prophets, and very often it's connected thematically. Now, this is a double portion, so there are some years that we read each portion separately, depending on how the Sabbath works out with holidays and whatever. It's a bit of a complicated calculation. If we have a leap year, whatever, we don't need to go into that today. But suffice it to say that some years we will read these two Torah portions separately, 2 different weeks, and sometimes we read it together. So actually, each Torah portion has its own Haftorah assigned to it. And so if we want to have a better understanding of what Zoraat is, in these 2 chapters in the prophets, they're both actually from 2 Kings, 2 different chapters in 2 Kings. Each of these are actually examples of Zoraat. They're stories about people with Zoraat. And so I want to kind of look at each of these and get a sense of maybe that can help us get a better understanding of what is this Zoraat, if it is a physical manifestation of a spiritual illness, what exactly is the problem? What's the spiritual illness, shall we say? So the first one is the story of Naaman. Naaman is 2 Kings chapter 5. And I don't know if you remember the story, but I'll relate it briefly. Naaman was a very senior military officer. He may have been the equivalent of the Ministry of Defense or something like that for the king of Aram. And this is a time, of course, where Aram is constantly, attacking Israel. Aram is a major empire almost, and they're enemy of Israel, and they're quite challenging, quite problematic, quite threatening. And Elisha is the prophet. And there's a situation where there's a girl who has been taken as a captive by the Aramites. And she serves this family of Naaman. Naaman, this high-ranking officer, and Naaman suffers terribly from Zoraat. Okay, this is not a Jew. This is an Aramite. He does not know anything about the Bible, and he suffers from this Zoraat. And this girl, this slave girl, says to her mistress, there is a prophet in Samaria who really knows how to cure this. Now, this is the interesting part. When Naaman, and the king says, yeah, you should go, and he sends him to Israel, maybe get fixed. His whole concept of what getting fixed is all about is a very pagan one. Again, he's looking for the magician who's going to wave his hand and go, hocus pocus, you are cured. Okay. When he comes to Elisha, of course, he's coming to someone with a completely different concept. One of the things, though, that is most obvious to us as we read the story is that this Naaman is one arrogant fella. He comes to Elisha. He stands at the entrance to Elisha's house, and he's waiting for Elisha to come out and say, oh, I'm your humble servant. What can I do for you? Elisha's sitting in the house, and he says to his people, he says, I'm not going to play this guy's game. This guy has to realize that I serve the God of Israel. I'm not a magician. I'm not going to, play his games. And he refuses to go out to him. So he gets mad, Naaman, and he's about to stomp off. And then his people say, look, you know what? Give this guy a chance. Anyway, he talks to Elisha and he says, okay, I need some help. And he's hoping that he's just going to, again, wave his hand and say, you're cured. And Elisha says to him, no, I want you to go down to the Jordan River and dunk yourself in the Jordan River 7 times. Well, this really gets him angry. The Jordan River, I don't know how many of you have been to the Jordan River, but river is a little bit of a overstatement. It's a really little teeny trickle thing. Okay, it's a little teeny river. And he says, are you crazy? You want me to go to go into the Jordan River? I'm coming from Damascus. We have the biggest waterways. And of course, he's near the Euphrates. I mean, we're talking, the Mississippi River of the Middle East. It's this huge waterway. You tell me I'm supposed to go dunk in this little stupid Jordan River? Well, his servant said, look, give it a chance. Can it hurt? He goes in, he dunks 7 times. He comes out a changed man. His Zoraat is gone. And he says, now I know, and this is very, very important. This is in verse 14. He says, now I know that there is no other God in all of the world but in Israel. And it's very interesting because here Elisha is teaching him a lesson, not only of the God of Israel, but of the God of Israel. That there's a certain special holiness of the land of Israel itself. It's the Jordan River. It's not the Euphrates, and it's the God of Israel. It's a great story. We could study this forever. It's a wonderful, wonderful, so much in this story in these few chapters there. But I think what one of the things that our commentators, one of the sins that they saw was a root of a cause for Zoraat was arrogance. And this Naaman is a prime example of arrogance. He is the way he looks at his own people, the way he looks at Elisha, as he looks at himself as, next to God. He looks at Aram as next to God. He looks at the river is next to God, right? And everything having to do with Israel is just nothing. And he has this total change. It's a lesson in humility that he gets, which of course brings him to a point where he is able to recognize the God of Israel. So that's the story of Naaman. Then there's another story. This is the Haftarah, the next chapter that is chosen to accompany the second of our Torah portions, Metzora, and that is the story that is in chapter 7. Just 2 chapters later, it's a story of 4 lepers. Now, this is a very interesting story. We're still at war with Aram. There's still a problem, okay? And there's a situation where there is a total famine in the capital city in Samaria. There's total famine, and they're just at a point where they have nothing to eat. They're desperate. They don't want to do. And basically, the reason they're in this situation is because Aram has laid siege to them, and they can't leave and they can't go, and they just don't know what to do. And they're in desperate situation. And then the story tells us there are 4 lepers. Now, lepers have been ostracized. They're outside the camp. They're outside the city. They sit just outside the gates of the city, and they are in a terrible situation. Everybody is starving. They say, what are we supposed to do? If we go into the city, we will just be as starving the same as everybody else. He says, maybe we need to go to the enemy camp. We'll go to Aram, to the enemy camp. He says, what could happen? Worst comes to worst, they'll kill us. But if we go into the city, we're going to die of starvation anyway, so we haven't lost anything. But who knows? Maybe they'll have food. Maybe they'll feel sorry for us, and they will feed us. Okay, so they take a chance, and they go, and they essentially defect. And they go to the enemy camp. They get to the enemy camp, and they go in there, and it's completely empty. What has happened is there's a miracle. God, the night before, made sounds of chariots and shooting and all kinds of stuff, made them feel like they were being attacked by a massive Israelite army. They got scared, and they just left their houses. They left everything. They ran off, gone. There is nothing, no person in the Aramite camp. What is the first thing these 4 lepers do? They plunder. They go from tent to tent, whatever, and they find all these gold and jewels, and they take it and they bury it, so it'll be there when they come back. And then all of a sudden, in the midst of all this plunder, they say, hey, you know something? Maybe we really need to go back to the city and tell the king that the Aramites are not here, so they don't have to worry. They can come out, and there's food here in the camp. And so, like, as a second thought, it's like an afterthought, they go back and they tell the king, by the way, the Aramites are gone. You're free. Come out. There's gold, silver, food, everything you want here. And that's what happens. They go, the whole city goes out, and they help themselves to everything from the Aramite camp, and everything is great. So, these guys are lepers. So first of all, what message this just the fact that they're lepers, because I find that it actually two different kind of contradictory messages here. But one, I say, a leper is an outcast, is somebody that has to be outside the camp. Now, these 4 lepers, it seems to be that they're in a state of leprosy. The kind of leprosy that we read about here in our Torah portion seems to be a temporary affliction. You usually have it for like a week, and then you purify yourself and you come out of it. We have a couple of instances later on in the Bible that tells us about, like Uzziah, who was the king, one of the kings of Judah. He is a leper. He dies with leprosy. I mean, he's a leper king for a long time. And this is situations that I'm not exactly sure how to treat this. This is that kind of leprosy, some kind of other kind. It's really not clear. But what we do see about these 4 lepers is that, yes, they're supposed to be outside the camp, but they seem to be outcasts. And there's a certain, I see here, a certain type of, I don't know, like a warning, if you're a leper, but like Miriam, she's outside the camp for a week. She purifies herself and comes back. Here, these people seem to be in a state of permanent outsiderness. And there's a real danger if you're a permanent outsider, because if you don't feel like you belong to your own people, then it's very easy for you to be a traitor and defect to the other side. And I think there's a certain message here for all of us, not to be so quick to boycott somebody or put somebody outside the pale. There's a risk in doing that, a practical risk, and maybe there's a moral issue underlining this as well. But if I'm going back to this idea of what we're trying to follow, what does this tell us? What is their criticism here of these 4 people? What does this tell us about who they were and perhaps maybe why they become lepers? I see this in their behavior. Not just that they were so easily ready to defect, that I think still is a problematic kind of behavior, but I think, and they say we can go into the city. It seems clear that, in this kind of situation, they would be allowed to come into the city. That's an option that they talk about. They don't want to do it because they say, well, it's desperate in the city. These are opportunists. And how do we know that? Because as soon as they see that Aram has fled, they don't immediately go back and tell their brothers and sisters, guys, you don't have to worry about starvation anymore. They're first busy, filling their coffers with the jewels. These are disgusting people. They are really not nice people. As an afterthought, oh wait, maybe people are starving over there. Maybe we need to go and tell them that there's food here. I mean, these are the kind of people. Now, it's very, very interesting. The Midrash connects these lepers with a fellow we've already met, Gehazi. Gehazi is Elisha's aide, his assistant, okay? And go back to the Naaman story. Remember what happens in the Naaman? You don't know. I didn't tell you. Some of you may know the story, but I'll very quickly tell you what happens with the Naaman story. Naaman is so grateful that he wants to give Elisha gifts, jewels and clothing and all kinds of gifts, because he is so grateful. And Elisha says, no, I have done this for God. This is God's work. You don't thank me. And it's very important for Elisha to refuse these gifts because he doesn't want in any way to deflect the glory of God. It is God who has healed Naaman, and it is God who has brought this change in Naaman, and he doesn't want anything to minimize that. So Naaman accepts this and he goes off. Gehazi says, now wait a second, the guy has riches and clothes. Elisha doesn't want to take this. He's crazy. I'm going to take it. He goes and runs after Naaman and he says, no. Elisha changed his mind. He really does want these gifts. And of course, Naaman very generously gives them all to Gehazi. Now this is terrible, because what Gehazi did, it wasn't just that he's money hungry. Gehazi cut the whole effect that Elisha was leaving him with, this effect of, this is God's work. Don't pay me for it. And Gehazi doesn't go and say, give it to me instead. He says, I'm coming in the name of Elisha. He just turns Elisha into another, I gave you some ideas and give me money. And the end of that story is that he becomes a leper. Gehazi becomes a leper, okay, and his children. And so the Midrash connects them and say, these lepers, it's Gehazi. Gehazi, we have already met this guy. They're money hungry, but not just money hungry. They have gone out of their way to destroy the effect of the Zoraat. God placed Zoraat on Naaman as a way of cutting his arrogance and enabling him to come to recognition of God. Gehazi came and tried to prevent that lesson. He was cutting that lesson. So in the end, he gets the Zoraat. So it's not just the arrogance. It's not just the money hungry. If we follow this line of thought, the idea of arrogance is so closely connected to the ability of someone to believe God and to recognize God. If you're too arrogant, you have no room for God in your life because you're God. You've made yourself a God. It's only when you are able to humble yourselves, then you have room to accept God into your life. And this is a very important process that God uses the Torah. So when Gehazi comes, and he tries to change all that, he tries to interfere with that, then he himself needs that same tzaraat. I don't know if he'll ever learn his lesson. He actually reforms himself a little bit later on. That's a different story. But we can see, though, how the tzaraat itself becomes a tool in God's hand to punish or to teach a lesson. Anyway, that's my message for today. Have a wonderful weekend. If anybody has a comment, welcome to hear it.
That was a terrific one. Thank you, Sondra. I think that it was a commentary on human behavior. Once more again, I mean, the Torah is brilliant in teaching us these, our own foibles, and that he is in charge of us. I mean, there is no other. It's terrific.
Absolutely. And it's also I think what you're saying is very good because we're basically, God knows humanity. Yes. He knows the kind of flaws and failings we will have. And the teachings in the Bible are not to say you all have to be perfect people, but it's basically saying, I know where you're going to fail, and this is where you have to learn.
And if we think about it, this was written so many years ago, and it's still pertinent to us today if we only read it.
Excellent. Excellent. Okay. Have a great weekend, everybody. And from Israel, I wish you happy birthday, Israel. 73 years old. It is a wonderful day today, a glorious day.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye, Sondra. Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed that video. And we'd like to be sure you're getting all of our video content. So just click on the subscribe button below as well as on the notification bell. And that way you will have easy access to all our material. We look forward to staying in touch with you. God bless you and have a wonderful day. I hope you enjoyed that video, and we'd like to be sure you're getting all of our video content. So just click on the subscribe button below as well as on the notification bell, and that way you will have easy access to all our material. We look forward to staying in touch with you. God bless you and have a wonderful day.